I've spent 38 years staring into the eyes of people who thought they were smarter than the law. As an assistant U.S. attorney specializing in financial crimes and high-level fraud, I've sat across from Ponzi scheme architects, identity thieves, and cold-blooded embezzlers. I've seen the way a liar's pupils dilate when they think they've landed the killing blow, and I've seen the sweat bead on a guilty brow when the evidence finally boxes them in. But I never expected to see that look while I was finishing my sea bass on a Sunday afternoon in the most expensive dining room in Dallas. I retired 4 years ago, trading the high-stakes adrenaline of the courtroom for the quiet, dusty peace of my study. My wife Eleanor passed away 11 years ago, leaving a void in this big house that no amount of antique book restoration or scotch could ever truly fill. My son, Kevin, was my North Star. At 35, he was a successful project manager at a top-tier tech firm, smart, kind, and perhaps a little too trusting. He'd inherited his mother's heart, which was a blessing for his friends but a liability in the shark-infested waters of the Dallas social scene. When he introduced me to Vanessa 8 months ago, I wanted to believe he'd finally found the one. She was breathtaking tall, with obsidian hair that fell perfectly over her shoulders and a smile that seemed to light up the room. She was cultured, spoke 3 languages, and claimed to come from an old money family in New Orleans that had lost its vast holdings in a series of unfortunate legal disputes. It was a classic damsel in distress narrative wrapped in a Chanel suit. I should have seen the red flags then. I should have noticed how her stories about her past were always slightly blurry, like a photograph out of focus. But I was so desperate to see Kevin happy, to see that light back in his eyes after years of being alone, that I let my professional guard down. I allowed myself to be just a father. That was my first mistake. The Sunday lunch at the French Room in the Adolphus Hotel was supposed to be a celebration. They had gotten engaged 2 weeks prior, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the soft clink of silver against china. Vanessa sat across from me, her mother, Patricia, flanking her like a silent, watchful sentinel. Patricia was a woman who wore her facelift with a terrifying, frozen dignity, her eyes moving over the room like a bird of prey looking for a weak spot in the herd. "Richard," Vanessa began, her voice like honey poured over gravel. "We've been doing some preliminary research into the wedding. We want it to be a tribute to our families, a bridge between Kevin's legacy and my heritage." I took a slow sip of my water, watching her. Kevin sat beside her, but he looked smaller than usual. His shoulders were hunched, and he hadn't touched his appetizer. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a gust of wind. "Legacy is important," I said neutrally. "What exactly did you have in mind?" Vanessa didn't hesitate. She pulled a leather-bound portfolio from her designer bag, a move so calculated it felt like she was serving me a subpoena. She opened it to a page filled with glossy photos of the Rosewood Mansion and intricate floral designs. "We've consulted with an elite planner," she said, her smile broadening, "to do this properly, to ensure the guest list is curated correctly and the experience is world-class. The budget comes to $1 million. That includes the venue buyout, the private charter for my relatives in Europe, the custom Vera Wang, and the security for the jewelry." The number hung in the air like a guillotine blade, $2 million. I've prosecuted men who killed for a fraction of that. In the world of Texas wealth, it's a high number. But for a wedding, it was an absurdity, a blatant, vulgar grab. $2 million, I repeated, my voice dropping into that low, dangerous register I used to use in front of a grand jury. "That's a very specific figure. For preliminary research." Patricia leaned forward, her jewelry clinking. "Our family has standards, Richard. We were prepared to contribute, of course, but as you know, our liquid assets are currently tied up in the New Orleans probate litigation. We thought, given your comfortable position and your love for your only son, you would want to ensure he starts his new life with the prestige he deserves." The manipulation was so clumsy it was almost insulting. They were trying to weaponize my love for Kevin against my bank account. They were betting that I was just another rich, lonely old man who would pay any price to keep his son's affection. I glanced at Kevin. He was staring at his plate, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. He was the picture of a man being held hostage in plain sight. I felt a surge of anger, but I kept my face a mask of polite interest. "I had learned a long time ago that you never show your hand until you're ready to take the whole pot." "I see," I said, leaning back. "And Kevin, you're on board with this? $2 million for a single day?" Kevin finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot. He opened his mouth to speak, but Vanessa's hand clamped down on his arm, not a loving touch, but a grip. Kevin wants me to be happy, don't you, honey? He knows how much this means to my mother and me. It's a lot, Kevin managed to say, his voice thin. It's an investment in your future, Patricia corrected sharply. Unless, of course, Richard, the Porter family isn't quite as legacy-heavy as we were led to believe. She was testing me, poking the bear to see if I'd react with my wallet to prove my status. I'd seen this play 100 times. It was the ego trap. I didn't know it yet, but the trap had already been set not for me but by me. I had spent the last week doing what I do best, digging. I had felt a coldness in Vanessa that didn't sit right with my gut, but I hadn't found the smoking gun yet. I needed her to overplay her hand. I needed her to get greedy. I'll need to see the itemized contracts, I said, my tone shifting to something more businesslike. Every vendor, every tax ID, every signed proposal. If I'm going to authorize a transfer of that magnitude, I need to see the paperwork. I'm sure you understand. Vanessa's smile didn't falter, but her eyes went hard. Of course, we have everything, but the deposits need to be paid by Tuesday to secure the rosewood. That's 48 hours, Richard. The pressure. The false sense of urgency, the hallmark of every con in the history of mankind. Just then, the waiter arrived to clear the plates. In the slight shuffle of movement, I felt something brush against my knee. It was Kevin's hand. He wasn't reaching for his napkin. He was sliding something toward me. I've spent years watching drug dealers pass glassines in back alleys through surveillance footage. I palmed the small, crumpled piece of paper with a dexterity that would have surprised my son. I kept my hands beneath the table, unfolding the note by touch as Vanessa continued her pitch about bespoke ice sculptures and imported cherry blossoms. I didn't look down. I couldn't. Patricia was watching me like a hawk. Instead, I waited for the moment the waiter returned with the wine list. As everyone's eyes shifted to the sommelier, I stole a glance at the paper in my hand. It was a page torn from a small notepad. The handwriting was frantic, the pen pressing so hard into the paper it had nearly torn through. It said 6 words that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. Dad, she's a scammer. Please help. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained a stone wall. My son wasn't a willing participant. He was a victim. He was being coerced, likely blackmailed, or worse. I looked at the woman sitting across from me, the beautiful, elegant Vanessa, and for the first time, I didn't see a daughter-in-law. I saw a predator who had made the catastrophic mistake of trying to hunt in my woods. I felt a cold, familiar fire ignite in my chest. It was the same feeling I got right before a closing argument in a high-profile racketeering case. Vanessa leaned forward, her perfume cloying and sweet. So, Richard, can we count on you, or do we need to tell the planner that the Porter family can't handle the requirements? I looked her dead in the eye. I didn't blink. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, until Patricia started to shift in her seat, and Vanessa's smug mask began to twitch at the corners. $2 million is a lot of money. Vanessa, I said slowly, but my son's happiness, that's priceless. I saw the triumph flash in her eyes. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd just landed the biggest score of her life. However, I continued, I don't do business on Sundays. Why don't you and your mother come to my house tomorrow evening? We'll go over the contracts together. If everything is in order, I'll have my private banker wire the funds on Tuesday morning. That would be wonderful, Vanessa purred. She reached across the table to touch my hand, but I pulled it back to reach for my wine glass. Oh, and Vanessa? I added, my voice dropping an octave. Yes, Richard? Bring your real ID, the one with your actual name on it. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. Vanessa's face didn't just pale, it went the color of ash. Beside her, Patricia's hand went to her throat, her fingers fumbling with her pearls. Kevin looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. He knew I'd seen the note, and he knew that the man sitting across from him was no longer his comfortable retired father. He was the man who had dismantled criminal empires. I have no idea what you mean, Vanessa whispered, her voice trembling. I think you do, I said, standing up and dropping a stack of $100 bills on the table to cover the check. I'll see you at 7 tomorrow. Don't be late. I hate it when people waste my time. I walked out of the French room without looking back, Kevin following close behind me. I could feel the heat of their stares on my back, a mixture of panicked calculation and desperate rage. But as I stepped out into the bright Dallas sun, I realized something that chilled me more than the note. I had spent my life studying the law, but I hadn't been paying attention to my own house. If Vanessa was a scammer, she wasn't working alone, and if my son was in trouble, it wasn't just about money. As we reached my car, Kevin grabbed my arm. His face was frantic. "Dad, you don't understand. It's not just the money. She has everything." "What do you mean, everything?" I asked. Kevin looked around the parking lot, his voice a panicked hiss. "She's been recording me. Everything, Dad. For months. If I don't give her the money, she said she'll destroy you. She said she'll make sure you go to prison for what you did in the Moreno case." I froze. The Moreno case was the one ghost that had followed me into retirement, a case where I'd made a choice 20 years ago that was legally gray but morally right. A choice only a few people in the world knew about. How did a 30-year-old girl from New Orleans know about a sealed file from 2 decades ago? I realized then that this wasn't just a wedding scam. This was a hit, and the person who had sent her was someone who knew my darkest secrets. The air in the Mercedes was thick enough to choke on. For a man who had spent his life in courtrooms, I was used to high-tension environments, but this was different. This was my son, the only piece of my heart that still beat outside my own chest, and he was vibrating with a fear so primal it made my hands ache on the steering wheel. I didn't drive toward his apartment. I drove toward my house, a fortress of limestone and mahogany where I could control the environment. "The Moreno case," I said, my voice barely a whisper as I navigated the Sunday traffic. How did she even say the name? Did she have documents, or was it just the name? Kevin was staring out the window, his breath fogging the glass. "She didn't show me documents, Dad. She showed me a video. It was an old deposition, or something like it. You were in a dark room, talking to a man whose face was blurred. You were telling him that the evidence against Moreno didn't matter because you were going to make the world right, regardless of the paperwork. She told me that if I didn't help her get the money, that video would find its way to the Department of Justice and the press. She said they'd strip you of your pension, your reputation, and put you in a cell next to the men you prosecuted." I felt a cold sweat prickle my hairline. The Moreno case, the first high-end lair born. It was the one time in 38 years I'd stepped over the line. Victor Moreno was a monster who had dissolved people in vats of acid, but he was protected by a wall of high-priced lawyers and bought-off witnesses. I had to witness a terrified kid who was going to be murdered if I didn't get him into protection immediately. I'd bypassed a dozen protocols, falsified a signature on a transport order, and had a very candid conversation with a confidential informant to make it happen. I'd saved the kid's life and put Moreno away for 3 life sentences. But the method? The method was a career killer. "She's been recording me too. Dad," Kevin continued, his voice cracking. "Every time I complained about her spending, every time I tried to pull away, she'd wait until we were in bed or after a few drinks, and she'd get me to talk about my frustrations with you. She's got hours of me sounding like a resentful, greedy son. She told me that if I went to the police, she'd release the Moreno video and the recordings of me, making it look like we were both in on some massive financial scam together. She's built a cage around us." I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine. I turned to look at my son. "Why didn't you tell me the moment this started?" "Because I loved her," he shouted, the tears finally breaking through. "For the first 4 months, she was perfect. She was everything I've ever wanted. By the time the mask started to slip, I was already buried. She'd already moved into my place, changed my passwords, and started managing my social circle. I felt like I was drowning, and every time I reached for air, she reminded me about Moreno. I didn't know how she found out. I still don't." I reached over and gripped his shoulder. "Listen to me, Kevin. A predator like Vanessa doesn't find a secret like that by accident." She was pointed toward it. "We aren't just dealing with a scammer, we're dealing with a vendetta." But she made one mistake. "What?" "She underestimated how much I'm willing to lose to protect you." We went inside, and I immediately led Kevin to my study. I locked the door and walked over to my desk, pulling out a burner phone I kept for consulting work. I needed eyes on the ground. I needed the kind of information that Google couldn't provide. I called Gerald Lawrence, a private investigator who used to be the lead detective on the Dallas fraud squad. He was the only man I trusted to dig into the dirt without leaving footprints. "Richard," Gerald's voice was gravelly, "it's Sunday. You should be halfway through a bottle of Pinot by now." "I need a deep dive, Gerald. 2 names. Vanessa Morales and her mother, Patricia. I need bank records, aliases, previous residences, and any connection to the Hang-in-Lair-born Moreno prosecution. And I need it yesterday. Moreno? That's a name I haven't heard in a decade. Give me 6 hours for the basics, 12 for the deep stuff. What's the stakes? 3. My son's life, I said, looking at Kevin, who was slumped in a leather chair, looking like a ghost of himself. And my soul. Call me the second you have a pulse on them. I hung up and turned to Kevin. I want you to stay here tonight. Don't answer your phone. Don't reply to her texts. If she calls, let it go to voicemail. We need to create a vacuum. Scammers panic when they lose the ability to provoke a reaction. Right now, she thinks she's the one holding the leash. We need her to start wondering if the leash just snapped. As Kevin settled into the guest room, I sat in the dark of my study, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the oaks outside. I began to reconstruct the last 8 months, looking for the cracks I'd missed. It had started at the Symphony Gala in October. Kevin had been glowing. He'd met Vanessa at the silent auction, and he'd been smitten within the hour. She was working in art consultancy, she told us. She was sophisticated but possessed a vulnerability that drew Kevin in. I remembered the first time she came to the house for dinner. She'd spent the entire evening asking me about my most difficult cases. I thought she was just interested in my career. Now, I realized she was scouting the terrain, looking for the soft spots in my history. And then there were the friends. Kevin's best friend since college, Matt, had stopped coming around by Christmas. I'd asked Kevin about it, and he'd sighed, saying Matt and Vanessa just didn't click. Then there was Jessica, Kevin's cousin, who had told me in confidence that Vanessa felt manufactured. I'd dismissed it as jealousy. I'd been a fool. The isolation was a classic tactic. By March, Vanessa had convinced Kevin to let her handle the administrative side of his life bills, schedules, even his digital security. She'd effectively hijacked his identity before he even realized he was in a fight. But the Moreno detail, that was the jagged pill I couldn't swallow. Only 3 people knew about that darkroom conversation. One was dead, one was me. The third was the man I had leaned on to get that witness out of town, a former U.S. Marshal named Silas Vane. Silas had disappeared from the grid years ago. If Vanessa had that video, it meant someone had raided a vault that was supposed to be impenetrable. Around Hong AM, my burner phone buzzed. It was a text from Gerald with a link to a private cloud folder. I opened it on my encrypted laptop and felt my breath hitch. There were no records for a Vanessa Morales prior to 5 years ago, but there were plenty for a woman named Vanessa Gutierrez. She'd been involved in 3 high-end marriage scams in Florida, Georgia, and Arizona. Each time the formula was identical: a wealthy, slightly older or isolated target, a whirlwind romance, a massive wedding budget demand, and then a tragic breakup weeks before the date, with Vanessa disappearing with the non-refundable deposits and emergency loans she'd coerced from the groom. But the real shock was Patricia. I scrolled through the mugshots from a Mutngin Chinchum Chin Muitarm racketeering bust in San Antonio. There she was, 25 years younger, but the eyes were unmistakable. Her name wasn't Patricia Morales, it was Elena Moreno. She was Victor Moreno's sister. The room seemed to spin. This wasn't just a scam. This was a long-game execution. They hadn't picked Kevin at random. They had hunted him. They had spent years waiting for the right moment to dismantle the man who had destroyed their family's criminal empire. They didn't just want my money, they wanted to watch me tear my own life down to save my son. What they didn't know was that I wasn't the same man I was in Hang-in-Lair-born. I was older, yes. I was retired, sure, but I no longer had to worry about the gray areas of the law. I was a father whose son had been used as a pawn in a blood feud. I picked up the phone and called Gerald back. Gerald, forget the bank records. I need you to find Silas Vane. I don't care what it costs. And I need you to find out where Elena Moreno has been hiding for the last 2 decades. Richard, if this is who I think it is, you're playing with fire. These people don't just sue you, they erase you. They already tried to erase my son's future, I said. My voice as cold as a grave. Now they're going to find out why I was the only prosecutor Victor Moreno was afraid of. I didn't sleep. I spent the rest of the night drafting a document, not a legal one, but a map of a war. I knew Vanessa and Patricia would be coming to my house at Bar, Hong PM the next day. They would arrive expecting a broken man ready to sign away his fortune to bury his secrets. They would expect a victim. What they were going to get was a master class in psychological warfare. As the sun began to rise over the Dallas skyline, I went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee. Kevin came down a few minutes later, his face haggard. "Did you find anything?" he asked, his voice trembling. I poured him a cup and pushed it across the counter. "I found out who they really are, Kevin, and I found out why they're doing this." I told him everything. I watched as the realization dawned on him that his great love was actually a weapon designed to destroy his father. I watched the heartbreak turn into something else, something sharper, something that looked a lot like the Porter family grit. "What do we do?" he asked. "If we don't give them the money, they'll release that video. They'll ruin you." "They think that video is their leverage," I said. "But leverage is only useful if you're afraid of the fall. I've spent my life building a reputation, Kevin. If I have to set it on fire to make sure those women never hurt anyone again, I'll strike the match myself." "But Dad," "No buts. We're going to play their game for exactly 12 more hours. You're going to call Vanessa. You're going to sound terrified. You're going to tell her that I'm breaking and that I've agreed to the transfer. Tell her to bring the final contracts to dinner tonight." "And then what?" I smiled, and for a second I felt 30 years younger. "And then, Kevin, we're going to show them that in this house, the only person who dictates the terms is me." What I didn't tell Kevin was the most dangerous part of the plan. I didn't tell him that I had already sent an encrypted file to a contact at the FBI, a file that contained a full confession of my actions in the Moreno case. I had already neutralized their blackmail by taking the weapon out of their hands myself. But Vanessa didn't know that. She still thought she held the knife to my throat, and as long as she thought that, she'd be overconfident. She'd be sloppy. At Sao, Bamui PM, the doorbell rang. It was early, a power move. I looked at Kevin. "Ready?" He took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." I opened the door. Vanessa was standing there, looking more beautiful than ever in a cream-colored silk dress, her mother a few paces behind her. She held a leather portfolio in one hand and a smile that looked like an invitation to a funeral. "Richard," she said, stepping into the foyer without being asked. "I hope you've had a productive day. We're so looking forward to finalizing our future." I stepped back, ushering them into the dining room. The table was set for 4. The candles were lit. The atmosphere was perfect. "Oh, it's been a very productive day, Vanessa," I said, pulling out a chair for her. "I've learned more in the last 24 hours than I have in the last 24 years. Please, sit. We have so much to discuss." As they sat, I noticed Patricia Elena looking around the room. Her eyes caught mine, and for a split second, the mask of the Southern socialite slipped. I saw the pure, unadulterated hatred of a woman who had waited 20 years for this moment. She leaned forward, her voice a low hiss. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Richard. We know you've talked to your son. We know you know the stakes, the money, now. Or the video goes live at midnight." I sat down at the head of the table and picked up a silver letter opener, turning it over in my hands. "The video," I mused. "It's a powerful piece of evidence. But you know what's more powerful, Elena? A confession." The room went stone-cold silent. Vanessa's hand froze on the latch of her portfolio. Patricia's eyes widened, her breath hitching in her throat. "I didn't think you'd remember me," Patricia whispered. "I never forget a Moreno," I said. "But before we talk about your brother, let's talk about the $2 million, because I have a counteroffer, and I think you'll find the terms non-negotiable." Non-negotiable. What happened next changed everything. I reached under the table and pulled out a small, black device. I pressed a button, and the voice of Vanessa Morales filled the room, not the sweet, cultured voice she used with Kevin, but a sharp, mocking tone from a recording Gerald had pulled from Kevin's hijacked cloud drive just an hour ago. "He's an old man, Mom. He's pathetic. He'll sign whatever I put in front of him because he's terrified of losing his honor. By the time he realizes the money is gone, we'll be in Grand Cayman, and he'll be in a federal pen. It's almost too easy." Vanessa's face went from ash to white. She looked at Kevin, but he wasn't looking at her with love anymore. He was looking at her with the cold, detached gaze of a man watching a bug get crushed. "What do you want?" Vanessa spat, the mask finally completely shattered. "I want you to tell me who gave you the Moreno file," I said. "Because I know it wasn't you, and I know it wasn't your mother. Someone else wants me dead, and you're just the bait." "Leader." The front door kicked open. I didn't move. I didn't need to. I knew exactly who it was, but I didn't know he'd be carrying a gun. The man standing in the wreckage of my front door wasn't a stranger. He was a ghost, Silas Vane, The former U.S. Marshal who had been my shadow during the Moreno years looked like he'd been dragged through the gears of a machine. His hair was a shock of unkempt white, his face a map of scars and broken capillaries, and the Glock muy bar in his hand was pointed directly at my chest. "Silas," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through me. "I wondered if you were still topside." "Shut up, Richard," Silas rasped. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on Patricia, or Elena, as I now knew her. He looked at her with a mixture of terror and subservience that made my stomach turn. Elena Moreno smiled, and for the first time, the refined Southern lady was gone completely. She looked younger, more vibrant, as if the presence of a weapon and a broken man had injected life back into her veins. "You shouldn't have gone digging, Richard. You were always so proud of your integrity." I wanted to see if that integrity was worth $2 million. Turns out it's worth even less. As I sat there, staring down the barrel of a gun held by a man I used to trust, my mind did what it always does in a crisis. It retreated into the evidence. I started looking back at the last 8 months, reevaluating every smile, every touch, every coincidence that had led us to this dining room. I realized now that the trap hadn't been set in October at the Symphony Gala. It had been set years ago, fueled by the kind of generational hatred that only a Moreno could harbor. I looked at Kevin. He was frozen, his eyes darting between Silas and Vanessa. I could see the pieces clicking into place for him too, the agonizing realization that his entire romantic awakening had been a choreographed performance. "The gala," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "You were wearing a red dress. You spent 45 minutes talking to the head of the Arts Council before you even glanced at Kevin. You made him chase you." Vanessa leaned back, her composure returning now that Silas was in the room. "He was so easy, Richard. He was so lonely. You'd been so busy with your books and your legacy that you didn't even notice your son was starving for someone to actually look at him. I gave him a mirror that showed him exactly who he wanted to be. A hero, a provider, a man." I remembered that first dinner in November. She had come to this house, and she had been so respectful. She'd asked to see my library. She'd lingered over the Moreno trial transcripts I kept on the high shelf. I'd thought it was intellectual curiosity. In reality, she was scouting the battlefield. She was looking for Silas Vane's name. "You found Silas first," I guessed, looking at Elena. "Silas was easy," Elena said, her voice dripping with contempt. "He never quite recovered from the Moreno case. The guilt, the booze, the gambling debts. A U.S. Marshal's pension doesn't go very far in the underground casinos of Shreveport. All I had to do was pay his markers and remind him what happens to marshals who help prosecutors fake transport orders. He gave me the video. He gave me everything." Silas didn't look at me. His hand was shaking just a fraction of an inch, but enough to see the conflict. "I didn't have a choice, Richard. They were going to kill my daughter." "Your daughter is fine, Silas," I said, trying to reach the man who used to believe in justice. "She's in Seattle, living her life. They lied to you." "Shut up," Silas screamed, and for a second, the gun barrel wavered. Vanessa sighed, a sound of bored irritation. "Can we get back to the money? The $2 million. I want the wire confirmation now, Richard, or Silas starts with Kevin's kneecaps. I'm tired of playing refined. I want to go to the airport." I looked at my son. This was the moment where the backstory became the front story. I thought about the thousands of dollars Kevin had already given her. The muy high, $100 for the car accident. I remembered him coming to me, embarrassed, asking for a short-term loan because his fiancée was in a bind. I'd given it to him without a second thought. Then there was the tarm, $100 for Patricia's surgery. Vanessa had cried in my kitchen, telling me how much she hated asking, how her family's pride was all they had left. I'd watched her play my son like a violin. She'd isolated him from Matt, his best friend, by hinting that Matt had made a pass at her. She'd manufactured a rift between Kevin and his cousin Jessica by accidentally revealing a secret Jessica had told her in confidence. Within 3 months, Kevin was living in a world where the only people he could trust were Vanessa and her mother. It was a masterpiece of psychological demolition. "You really are a piece of work," Kevin said, his voice low and vibrating with a new kind of strength. I looked at him and saw the fear beginning to burn away, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. "I gave you everything. I would have given you my life. And all this time you were just waiting for the check to clear?" Vanessa laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Kevin, honey, look at yourself. You're a project manager for a mid-level tech firm. You're sweet, but you're boring. You're the kind of man women marry when they want to retire. I'm 32 years old. I'm not ready to retire into a life of Sunday lunches and antique books. I wanted the Porter fortune, and I wanted the Moreno revenge. 2 birds, 1 stone. The money isn't coming, Vanessa, I said quietly. Elena narrowed her eyes. Don't play games, Richard. You said you'd wire it. I lied, I said, just like you lied. I don't have a private banker waiting for a call. What I have is a forensic accountant and a team from the FBI's public corruption unit who have been monitoring this room since the moment you stepped inside. It was a bluff, a massive, desperate bluff. I didn't have the FBI, not yet. I had Gerald and I had the documents, but I had been waiting for the meeting to gather the final piece of evidence, the admission of the Moreno connection. Elena laughed. The FBI? In a house with this much gray area in its history? You're more arrogant than my brother was. Silas, check him for a wire. Silas stepped forward, his face a mask of misery. He reached out to pat me down, his gun still leveled at my head. As he moved closer, I caught the scent of stale whiskey and old fear. Silas, I whispered as he reached my waist. Remember the kid? The one we saved from Moreno? He's a doctor now. He has 2 kids. Was it worth it? Silas paused. His hand hovered over my jacket pocket. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. I saw the struggle in his eyes, the man he was versus the man he had become. I'm sorry, Richard, he whispered back, but he didn't find a wire, because I wasn't wearing one. He's clean, Silas announced, stepping back. Vanessa smirked. Told you, Mom. He's all talk. He's a prosecutor without a courtroom, a lion without teeth. She shoved the portfolio across the table toward me. Sign the authorization. It's all pre-filled. $2 million to the Elite Wedding Designs account. Do it now or Silas pulls the trigger. I looked at the document. It wasn't an authorization for a wedding. It was a transfer to an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands, a company I recognized from the Moreno files 20 years ago. The Black Star Fund. They weren't just taking my money, they were using it to restart the Moreno operation. If I sign this, I said, looking at Elena, you'll still release the video. You'll still destroy me, because that was the plan all along, wasn't it? Take the money, then burn the house down anyway. Elena smiled. You were always the smartest person in the room, Richard. It was your most annoying quality. Yes, we're going to take your money, and then we're going to send that video to every news outlet in the state. We're going to watch you rot in a cell while we live on your dime. It's the perfect circle. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I looked at Kevin, and in that moment, I saw him reach for the steak knife he'd been hiding under his napkin. Kevin, no, I said firmly. He's right, Kevin. Vanessa cooed. Don't be a hero. It doesn't suit you. I turned back to the document. I started to sign, my pen scratching against the heavy paper, but I didn't sign my name. I wrote 2 words in the signature line, Lucy's Law. Elena frowned. What is that? That's not your name. It's not a name, I said, dropping the pen. It's a trigger. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. The dining room was plunged into pitch-black darkness. Silas, shoot him, Elena screamed. A gunshot rang out, the muzzle flash illuminating the room for a split second like a lightning strike. I felt the wind of the bullet whistle past my ear, shattering a vase on the sideboard behind me. Silas, no, Kevin yelled. I dove for the floor, dragging Kevin down with me. In the darkness, I heard the sound of glass breaking and the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. I can't do it. Silas's voice was a ragged howl. I can't do it again. You coward, Vanessa shrieked. I heard a scuffle, the sound of high heels clicking frantically on the hardwood, and then the heavy front door slamming open. They're running, Kevin shouted, scrambling to his feet. Let them, I said, grabbing his arm. The house is surrounded, Kevin. I didn't have the FBI, but I did have Gerald, and Gerald brought the one person Elena Moreno forgot about. The lights flickered back on. Silas Vane was slumped against the wall, his gun on the floor, his head in his hands, weeping openly. But it was the man standing in the doorway that made my heart stop. He was in his 30s, wearing a suit that looked a bit too big for him, his face etched with a grim determination. He looked exactly like the terrified kid Silas and I had saved 20 years ago. Hello, Mr. Porter, the man said. Gerald said you might need a witness. Who are you? Kevin asked, breathless. My name is David, the man said. I'm the Moreno video, or at least, I'm the part of the story they didn't want the world to see. I stood up, brushing the dust off my suit. I looked at Silas, then at David. The plan was working, but the cost was already mounting. "Where are they?" I asked. "They didn't get far," David said. "But Richard, you need to see what was in Vanessa's car. It wasn't just the money they were after." I walked out onto the front porch. Vanessa and Elena were pinned against their Mercedes by two men I didn't recognize, Gerald's associates. But the trunk of the car was open. Inside, there wasn't luggage. There were dozens of files. Hundreds of them. I walked over and picked one up. My name was on the tab. I opened it and felt a cold chill wash over me. It wasn't just about the Moreno case. It was a list of every person I had ever prosecuted, every witness I had ever protected, and every secret I had ever kept. "They weren't just planning to destroy you, Dad," Kevin said, appearing at my side. "They were planning to sell these. They were going to start a war." But as I looked at Vanessa, she wasn't looking at me with fear. She was looking past me, toward the dark tree line at the edge of my property. She started to laugh. A low, bubbling sound that made my skin crawl. "You think this is over, Richard?" she whispered. "You think my mother is the mastermind? She's just a grieving sister. She's the emotional one." "Then who?" I asked. "Look at the last file," she said, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying light. "The one at the very bottom, the one without a name." I reached into the trunk and pulled out the final folder. It was thick, heavy, and blank. I opened it, and as I read the first page, my world didn't just spin, it collapsed. The first page was a birth certificate. It was Vanessa's birth certificate. And the father's name wasn't Victor Moreno, it was Richard Vernon Porter. The world didn't just go silent, it seemed to stop spinning altogether. I stood there on the gravel driveway, the humid night air pressing against my skin like a wet shroud, staring at a piece of paper that shouldn't exist. My name, Richard Vernon Porter, was typed in clear, authoritative ink next to the word father. The mother listed wasn't Eleanor, it was Elena Moreno. I felt a cold, hollow sensation in my chest, the kind of vacuum that forms right before a building collapses. I looked at the date, 32 years ago, a year before I met Eleanor. A year when I was a young, ambitious prosecutor in New Orleans on a temporary task force thinking I was invincible. I didn't know it yet, but that piece of paper was a grenade with the pin already pulled, and I was the only one holding it. I looked up at Vanessa. She was leaning against the car, her hands cuffed behind her back, but she held herself with a newfound, terrifying regality. The damsel was dead. The scammer was gone. What was left was something far more dangerous, a claimant. A daughter who had been raised in the shadows of a criminal empire, fed on a diet of resentment and coached by a woman who had spent 3 decades perfecting her revenge. "Hello, Dad," Vanessa whispered, the words dripping with a venomous satisfaction. "Did you really think you could just bury us? Did you think the Moreno girl was just a footnote in your glorious career?" I felt Kevin's presence beside me, but he felt miles away. I could hear his breathing shallow, jagged, the sound of a man watching his entire reality dissolve into a nightmare. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at me, and the expression in his eyes was something I will carry to my grave. It wasn't just shock. It was a deep, soul-shattering betrayal. To him, I was the man of unimpeachable honor. I was the father who stayed true to his mother's memory. Now, in the span of a heartbeat, I was a stranger with a secret life and a daughter who had just spent 8 months pretending to be his soulmate. "Dad," Kevin's voice was a ghost. "Tell me this is a fake. Tell me she forged this. Tell me you didn't." "You wouldn't." I opened my mouth, but the words were lodged in my throat like dry stones. My mind raced back to that summer in New Orleans. I had been 26. I had been reckless. I had been working a case against a local syndicate, and I had met a woman in a jazz club, a woman who called herself Lena. She was haunting, brilliant, and seemingly caught in a life she hated. It had been a 2-week whirlwind, a lapse in judgment that I had convinced myself was a harmless indulgence before I returned to my real life in Dallas. I never saw her again. I never knew her last name was Moreno. I never knew she was Victor's sister until the trial years later, and even then, I never made the connection. I had buried that memory so deep I'd almost convinced myself it was a dream. "I didn't know, Kevin," I managed to say, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "I swear to you, I had no idea." "You didn't know?" Elena's voice cut through the dark, sharp as a razor. She was still pinned against the car by Gerald's man, but she was laughing now. "You were so busy making the world right, Richard. You didn't care about the girl you left behind in that walk-up on Bourbon Street. You didn't care that I was pregnant when you packed your bags and headed back to your legacy. I watched you on the news for years. I watched you marry that woman. I watched you have him." She gestured toward Kevin with a sneer. The golden boy, the legitimate heir. The psychological tension was thick enough to taste. I could feel the trap closing. This wasn't just about the $2 million. That had been the bait to get me to open the door, to get me to a place where I was vulnerable. The real goal was the total annihilation of my family. Vanessa hadn't just scammed Kevin. She had lived in his house, slept in his bed, and whispered, "I love you," to a man who, if that paper was real, was her own half-brother. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it made my stomach heave. "You knew," I said, looking at Elena, the horror finally crystallizing. "You knew who Kevin was. You sent her to find him. You let them be together." "I didn't just let them," Elena hissed. "I encouraged it. I wanted her to be the one to tell you. I wanted to see the look on your face when you realized that your integrity had led to the ultimate sin. I wanted to destroy your bloodline from the inside out." Vanessa looked at Kevin then, her eyes devoid of any warmth. "You were so easy to love, brother. You have our father's eyes, but you have your mother's weakness. You were just a means to an end. A way to get into the house. A way to get into the will." Kevin made a sound of choked, guttural sob and turned away, stumbling back toward the house. I wanted to go to him, to grab him, to tell him we would fix this, but I was anchored to the spot by the weight of my own past. I realized then that I had been playing checkers while they were playing a multi-generational game of psychological chess. Every open loop in my life, every secret I'd ever kept, had been woven into this net. "What now, Richard?" Gerald asked, stepping into the light. He looked at me with a grim sympathy. He'd seen the birth certificate. He knew the legal and personal implications. "The police are 5 minutes out. We have them for the fraud, the attempted extortion, and whatever Silas is going to testify to. But this," he nodded toward the folder, "this changes the jurisdiction of the pain." "It doesn't change anything," I said, trying to claw back some semblance of the prosecutor I used to be. I turned to Vanessa. "If you think this gives you a claim to anything I own, you're wrong. You've committed multiple felonies tonight. You've admitted to a conspiracy to defraud. You're going to prison, daughter or not." Vanessa smiled, a slow, terrifyingly calm expression. "Oh, I know I'm going to prison, Richard, but I'm taking your name with me. I'm taking Kevin's sanity with me, and I'm taking the Moreno files. Did you really think those were the only copies? My mother has a digital fail-safe. If we aren't at a specific location by midnight, every secret in those folders goes to the press. The Moreno video is just the beginning. There are records of judges you bribed, witnesses you intimidated, and the Lucy's Law you just mentioned. That's in there too." I felt the ground shift again. Lucy's Law wasn't a law. It was a nickname for a series of off-the-book settlements I'd facilitated for victims of police brutality early in my career. Money that didn't come from the city, but from seized assets that hadn't been properly logged. It was a noble cause with a crooked execution. If that went public, it wouldn't just be my reputation. Dozens of good men would go down with me. The escalation was relentless. Each twist stripped away another layer of my defense. I looked at Silas Vane, who was still sitting on the porch, staring at his hands. He'd been the one to help me with Lucy's Law. He was the leak. He hadn't just given them the Moreno video. He'd given them the keys to my entire career's basement. "Silas," I called out, my voice cracking. "Why?" "They had my daughter, Richard," he yelled back, his voice breaking. "And they told me you were going to throw me under the bus for the Moreno transport order anyway. They said you were cleaning house before retirement. I was scared. I'm old, and I'm tired, and I didn't want to die in a cage." Manipulation at its finest. They had fed Silas lies to turn him against me, used his fear to harvest my secrets, and then used those secrets to bait my son. It was a closed loop of betrayal. Suddenly, a loud, piercing alarm began to blare from Vanessa's Mercedes. A red light started flashing on the dashboard. "That's the timer, Richard," Elena said, her voice rising above the siren. "You have 20 minutes. 20 minutes before the upload starts. The only way to stop it is a biometric override on my phone. Uncuff me. Give us the $2 million in cash, I know you have it in the safe, and let us go. Or you can spend the rest of your life in a cell, watching your son's face on every news channel as the victim of the incestuous prosecutor's scandal." The humiliation was the point. They wanted me to crawl. They wanted me to choose between my honor and my son's life, all while they walked away with the fortune they felt they were owed as the rightful Morenos. I looked at the house. I could see Kevin through the living room window, He was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. He looked broken. I had spent 38 years fighting for justice, but in this moment justice felt like a hollow, cruel joke. If I followed the law, I would lose my son. If I broke the law to save him, I would become the monster Elena always believed I was. I took a deep breath. The old prosecutor in me, the one who could find the loophole in a sealed indictment, started to stir. I looked at the birth certificate again. Something caught my eye. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail in the seal of the New Orleans parish. "Gerald," I said, my voice suddenly cold and sharp, "bring me my magnifying glass from the study and get the lights on the porch as bright as they'll go." "What is it, Richard?" "Just get it," I snapped. Vanessa's smirk wavered for the first time. "It's real, Richard. You can check the DNA if you have time, but you don't." I didn't answer. I waited for Gerald to return with the glass. I held the paper up to the light, my heart hammering. I scanned the fine print of the registrar's signature. I looked at the embossed stamp. I looked at the ink density. I didn't know then that the paper was just the first layer of the grave they'd dug for me, but I knew one thing. Even the best liars leave a fingerprint. 20 minutes, Richard. Elena screamed over the alarm. "Decide." I looked at the birth certificate, then at the two women who were trying to erase my life. I felt a grim, dark smile pull at the corners of my mouth. "You're right, Elena," I said, tossing the magnifying glass onto the hood of the car. "It looks perfect. The seal, the signatures, even the paperweight. It's a masterclass in forgery." "It's not a forgery," Vanessa shrieked. "It is," I said, leaning in close to her. "Because the registrar who supposedly signed this in Mut Ngin Chin Tram Chin Mui born. I prosecuted him in Mut Ngin Chin Tram Chin Mui High for selling fake birth certificates to the Moreno syndicate. He died in prison in Mut Ngin Chin Tram Chin Mui Ba. This paper wasn't just forged, it was forged using an old dead man's stamp that your brother kept in his desk." I saw the flicker of doubt in Vanessa's eyes, but I wasn't done. "And as for the DNA, I had a vasectomy in Mut Ngin Chin Tram Chin Mui, 2 years before I ever stepped foot in New Orleans. There was never a daughter, Elena. There was never a Lena in a jazz club." "You didn't find my secret. You tried to build one." The silence that followed was absolute. The alarm on the car suddenly cut out, leaving only the sound of the wind in the trees. Elena's face contorted into a mask of pure, primal rage. "You think that matters?" she hissed. "The files are still going up. The Moreno video, the bribe records. It doesn't matter if she's your daughter or not. You're still finished." I checked my watch. "Actually, Elena, you should check your own phone. Or rather, check the digital failsafe you were so proud of." I pulled my own phone out and showed her the screen. It was a live feed of a server room, one I had set up months ago when I first suspected Kevin was being targeted. "I didn't have the FBI earlier," I said, my voice like a serrated blade, "but I have them now. And they've been sitting on your failsafe server for the last 6 hours. The only thing that's going to be uploaded at midnight isn't my secrets. It's the GPS coordinates of every shell company, every offshore account, and every accomplice you've ever used." Vanessa's knees buckled. She sank to the gravel, her regality vanishing. She looked small, pathetic, and defeated. "But how?" she whispered. "I'm a prosecutor, Vanessa," I said, looking down at her. "I don't just wait for the evidence to come to me. I create the conditions for the evidence to reveal itself." I turned back toward the house to find Kevin. I needed to tell him the truth. I needed to tell him that he was still the only son I ever had. But when I reached the porch, I saw the front door was wide open, and Kevin was gone. On the small table in the foyer, where he always left his keys, was a single note. "I can't do this anymore, Dad. Don't come looking for me." The victory I had just won felt like ashes in my mouth. I had saved my reputation, but I had lost my son. And as I looked out into the darkness of the Dallas night, I realized that the Morenos hadn't needed a daughter to destroy me. They just needed me to be myself. What happened next changed the stakes from a legal battle to a race for a life. Because as I picked up Kevin's note, I noticed the smudge of blood on the corner of the paper. I didn't realize the blood was still wet until a smear of crimson stained my thumb, right over the word, "looking." It wasn't a large spray, just a single, frantic smudge, but in the sterile light of the foyer, it looked like a scream. My heart, which I'd spent decades training to beat with the steady rhythm of a metronome, suddenly felt like a trapped bird battering against my ribs. I turned back to the driveway, the note clutched in my shaking hand, my voice failing me for the first time in my life. "Where is he?" I roared, the sound echoing off the limestone walls of my home. "Vanessa, where is my son?" Vanessa didn't flinch. She was still sitting on the gravel, her designer dress ruined, her hair a tangled mess, but she looked up at me with a grin that was jagged and triumphant. "You were so busy playing the Great Inquisitor, Richard. So focused on the birth certificate and the Lucy's Law and your precious reputation, you forgot that Kevin was the one sitting alone in the house with your secrets. What did you do to him?" I stepped off the porch, my stride long and predatory. Gerald moved to intercept me, fearing I'd do something that would jeopardize the legal standing of the arrests, but I pushed him aside. I reached Vanessa and hauled her to her feet by the collar of her silk dress. "He's your brother, remember? That was your story. You said you shared his blood. Where is he?" "He's exactly where he needs to be," she hissed, her breath smelling of the expensive wine I'd poured for her less than an hour ago. "He saw the video, Richard. Not the one of you and Moreno. The other one. The one I made of us. He couldn't handle the thought of what we'd done if that paper was real. He broke. And when a man breaks that badly, he doesn't just walk away, he looks for an exit." I felt the world tilt. I had spent the last 20 minutes proving the forgery to the women who had created it, but I hadn't been there to prove it to the boy who had been victimized by it. To Kevin, the last hour hadn't been a tactical victory, it had been a descent into a moral abyss. He'd been forced to believe he'd committed an unspeakable sin with a woman who was now revealed to be his half-sister. The psychological trauma of that realization, even if it was a lie, was enough to shatter anyone. But there was blood on the note. "The blood," I whispered, leaning in so close our noses almost touched. "Kevin doesn't bleed when he's sad, Vanessa." "Who was in the house?" Elena Moreno started to laugh from behind the car, a low guttural sound that chilled me more than the threat of prison ever could. "You think we came here with just a broken-down U.S. Marshal?" Silas was the key to the past, Richard. But we hired someone for the future. I dropped Vanessa and spun around, scanning the tree line, the shadows, the dark corners of my own property. I had spent 38 years thinking I was the one holding the leash on justice, but I had been blind to the fact that I was the one being hunted. "Gerald, search the house. Now," I commanded. I didn't wait for him. I ran back inside, my footsteps thundering on the hardwood. The living room was empty. The kitchen was silent, the scent of the untouched dinner still lingering in the air. I ran toward the back of the house, toward my study, and that's where I saw it. The window was shattered, the heavy velvet curtains fluttering in the night breeze. On the floor, amidst the shards of glass, was a heavy brass paperweight from my desk, and next to it, a much larger pool of blood. My knees hit the floor. This wasn't a smudge. This was a wound. I looked at the desk and realized what was missing. The Lucy's Law file. I had pulled it from the safe earlier to verify the details, and I'd left it on the blotter. It was gone. I didn't know it yet, but the escalation hadn't reached its peak. The Morenos hadn't just wanted my money or my reputation. They wanted the one thing that could truly erase me. They wanted to turn my son into a criminal. I scrambled to my feet and checked the security monitor in the corner of the study. The feed was looped, a 30-second clip of an empty hallway playing over and over again. They'd hacked my internal system. They'd been in the house while I was on the driveway. They'd been in the house while I was feeling smug about the birth certificate. "Richard, look at this," Gerald shouted from the hallway. I ran out to find him standing by the garage door. The door was open, the space where Kevin's SUV usually sat now a yawning, empty dark hole. But it wasn't the car that caught my eye. It was the man lying on the concrete floor, groaning in pain. It was Matt, Kevin's best friend, the one Vanessa had supposedly driven away months ago. "Matt?" I knelt beside him, pressing a clean rag to the gash on his forehead. "What happened? What are you doing here?" Matt blinked, his eyes unfocused. I've been following them, Mr. Porter, for weeks. I knew she was a fake. I tried to tell Kevin, but she'd blocked my number on his phone. I saw them pull up tonight, and I saw a man go in through the back. I followed him in. He had Kevin. He had him in a chokehold. He was forcing him to sign something. "Who was it, Matt? Who was the man?" "I don't know," Matt wheezed, clutching his side. "Big guy, tattoos on his neck. He hit me with something heavy. He told Kevin that if he didn't come with him, he'd kill you out on the driveway. He told Kevin that the only way to save your legacy was to take the files and run." The manipulation was perfect. They hadn't just broken Kevin's spirit. They had weaponized his love for me. They had convinced him that the only way to protect his father from the Moreno video and the Lucy's Law exposure was to become a fugitive himself. He had taken the files to keep them from the press, thinking he was sacrificing his own life to save mine. "And the blood on the note?" It wasn't Kevin's. It was Matt's. The man had forced Kevin to write that note while Matt lay bleeding on the floor, using the blood of his best friend to sign his own disappearance. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. The time for law was over. The time for procedure was gone. I walked back out to the driveway. The police cruisers were pulling into the gates now, their blue and red lights painting the limestone in strobing colors. 2 officers stepped out, guns drawn, but I ignored them. I walked straight up to Elena Moreno. "You're going to tell me where they took him," I said, my voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. "Or what, Richard?" she sneered, watching the police approach. "You'll prosecute me? You'll put me in a cell? I've been in a cell for 20 years, living in the shadow of what you did to my brother. I have nothing to lose." I leaned in, my shadow falling over her like a shroud. "You think you're the only one who knows how to work outside the lines? You think because I have a badge in my past I've forgotten how the world works? You tell me where that man took my son, or I swear to the God you don't believe in, the police won't get you to the station. I'll tell them you reached for a gun. I'll tell them Silas shot you, and they'll believe me, Elena, because I'm Richard Porter, and you're just a Moreno." For the first time I saw a flicker of real fear in her eyes. She knew I wasn't bluffing. She had pushed a man who had spent his life protecting the light until he was finally comfortable in the dark. "The old airfield," she stammered, her voice cracking. "South of the city. Midlothian. There's a hangar registered to a shell company. They're taking him there to wait for the boat. They're going to make him record a confession, Richard. A confession that says he stole the money, that he killed his sister in a fit of rage, and then they're going to make sure he never comes back. They were framing him for a murder that hadn't happened yet. They were going to kill Vanessa and make it look like Kevin did it to hide the incest. It was a double homicide of a reputation and a life." I turned to the police officers who were now surrounding us. "Officers, these women are under arrest for kidnapping, attempted murder, and organized criminal activity. My private investigator has the evidence. My son is currently being held at the Midlothian airfield. I need a tactical unit there now. Sir, we need you to step back." "I'm not stepping back," I yelled. "I am the former assistant U.S. attorney for this district, and my son is about to be executed. Call your sergeant. Now." As the officers began to radio in the situation, I didn't wait for the bureaucracy. I grabbed my keys and ran for my own car. Gerald jumped into the passenger seat before I could pull away. "Richard, wait for the SWAT team," he shouted. "They won't be fast enough," I said, flooring the accelerator. "They'll follow the sirens." I'm following the blood. We tore out of the driveway, the Mercedes fishtailing on the gravel. As we hit the main road, my phone buzzed in the center console. It was an unknown number. I swiped to answer, putting it on speaker. "Dad?" It was Kevin. His voice was thick, muffled, like he was speaking through a rag. "Kevin, where are you? Are you hurt?" "I'm sorry, Dad," I sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't let them destroy you. I have the files. I'm going to burn them. I'm going to make sure no one ever sees what you did." "Kevin, listen to me. The files don't matter. The birth certificate was a fake. Vanessa isn't your sister. It was all a lie, Kevin. Do you hear me? All. I. It was a lie." There was a moment of silence on the other end, followed by the sound of a heavy blow and a muffled grunt of pain. "He heard you, Richard." A man's voice came through the phone, deep, cold, and entirely unfamiliar. "But it doesn't change the ending. He's already signed the confession. And now, he's going to help me with the cleanup. If you touch him, I will spend every cent I have to make sure you spend the rest of your life in a hole so deep you'll forget what the sun looks like," I growled. The man laughed. "I've already been in that hole, Richard. You're the one who put me there. 10 years for a crime I didn't commit, just so you could pad your conviction rate. Don't you remember me? It's Miller. From the Hang In Lair Mui High Docks case. Another ghost. Another man I'd stepped on during my climb to the top. The Morenos hadn't just found a scammer. They had built a coalition of the people I'd broken. Miller, listen to me. See you at the airfield, Mr. Prosecutor, he said. Bring your integrity. You're going to need it when you watch your son die. The line went dead. I looked at the speedometer. Matrum Mui miles per hour. The city lights were fading behind us, replaced by the dark, flat stretches of the Texas plains. I was racing toward a man I'd wronged, to save a son I'd failed, to stop a woman I'd created through my own arrogance. I didn't know then that the airfield was just the stage for the final reversal. I didn't know that Vanessa wasn't just a victim in this plan, or that she had a secret even her mother didn't know. But as we saw the flicker of the hangar lights in the distance, I felt a vibration under my seat. I reached down and found a small, black box taped to the frame of the passenger chair. It was a tracker, but it wasn't the police's tracker. "Gerald," I said, my voice trembling. "Who else did you tell about tonight?" Gerald looked at the box, then at me, and for the first time in 20 years, the man I trusted most in the world looked away. "I had to, Richard," he whispered. "They have my family too." The betrayal was complete. I was walking into a trap with the man who was supposed to be my backup, and the only person who could save my son was the man who had every reason to want me dead. The silence in the car after Gerald's admission was heavier than the darkness outside. I looked at the man who had been my right hand for 2 decades, the man I'd trusted with my life and my son's safety, and for a second, I didn't see a friend. I saw a hollow shell. Gerald's hands were trembling on his knees, his eyes fixed on the dashboard as if the plastic dials held the answers to his sins. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "Since the Symphony Gala," Gerald whispered. "They didn't just target Kevin, Richard. They targeted everyone in your orbit. They took photos of my grandkids at the park. They sent me a video of my daughter's house in Plano with a sniper's reticle centered on her front door. They told me that if I didn't keep them informed of your countermoves, they'd start sending me pieces of them." I felt a wave of nausea. I had spent my life thinking I was the one playing the long game, but Elena Moreno had been weaving a web that spanned every person I cared about. She hadn't just studied my cases, she'd mapped my soul. "The tracker," I said, glancing down at the black box. "Who's on the other end?" "Miller," Gerald said. "And someone else. Someone they call the architect. I don't know who he is, Richard. I've only heard his voice on the phone. He's the one who coordinated the hacks, the loops on your security cameras, everything." I looked out at the flat, black horizon. We were miles from help, racing toward a trap with a man who was feeding our location to the enemy. Most men would have slammed on the brakes, kicked Gerald out, and turned around. But I couldn't. My son was at the end of that tracker's signal. "Keep driving," I said. "Richard, you heard me. They're waiting for us. They're waiting. They're waiting for us." "It's an execution." "I know," I said, reaching into the glove box and pulling out a heavy, snub-nosed revolver I kept for emergencies. "But they're expecting a desperate father. They're not expecting a man who has nothing left to lose but his shame." We reached the airfield 10 minutes later. It was a desolate patch of cracked asphalt and rusted corrugated metal, hidden behind a screen of mesquite trees. A single hangar at the far end was bathed in a sickly yellow light. Outside, Kevin's SUV sat idling, its headlights cutting through the dust. I made Gerald stay in the car. I didn't trust him to be my backup, but I needed him alive to tell the police the truth if I didn't make it out. I stepped out into the wind, the scent of aviation fuel and old rot filling my lungs. I walked toward the hangar, the revolver tucked into the small of my back, my heart beating with a cold, rhythmic precision. The hangar door was partially open, groaning on its rusted tracks. I slipped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The space was cavernous, filled with the skeletons of old Cessnas and stacks of oil drums. In the center, under a single hanging bulb, was a wooden table. Kevin was slumped in a chair, his hands tied behind him. His face was a mask of bruises and dried blood, his eyes half closed. Standing over him was Miller, the man from the Hangin Lair Muay Docks case. He was bigger than I remembered, his neck thick with scar tissue, his eyes reflecting the dull yellow light with a predatory glint. "Welcome to the end of the line, Mr. Prosecutor," Miller said, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "Where is she?" I asked, my eyes scanning the shadows. "Where's Vanessa?" "She's finishing the upload," a voice called out from the darkness above. I looked up to see a catwalk running along the ceiling. Vanessa was standing there, a laptop in her hands, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. She looked down at me with a detached, clinical interest. "The fail-safe you thought you'd bypassed? That was just the first layer, Richard. This is the real one. In 5 minutes, every file in that Lucy's Law folder goes to the national press. And your son's confession? It's already been time-stamped." I looked at Kevin. He groaned, his head lolling to the side. "Dad, go, please." "He's a good kid, Richard," Miller said, stepping behind Kevin and placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "A bit soft, though. He really believed he was saving you. He signed the papers so fast he almost tore the pen through the page. A confession to the murder of Vanessa Morales. A confession to the theft of $2 million. It's all there. You haven't killed her yet, I said, looking up at Vanessa. Not yet, she said, her voice dropping an octave. But once the upload is complete, I become a ghost, and Kevin becomes a monster. You'll spend the rest of your life trying to prove he was coerced. But the evidence we've planted? It's airtight. We've even got the incestuous messages he supposedly sent me. Your legacy doesn't just end tonight, Richard. It rots. I felt the weight of my life pressing down on me. 38 years of making the world right had led to this. My son's life traded for a lie. My reputation used as a weapon against the people I'd tried to protect. This was rock bottom. There were no more loopholes, no more legal maneuvers, no more bluffs. I looked at Miller. The hang in Lair my high docs case, you were innocent. Miller's face twisted into a snarl. You knew the witness was lying, but you needed a win to get that promotion. You put me away for 10 years, Richard. My mother died while I was inside. My wife moved on. I came out with nothing but the clothes on my back and a hole in my chest where my life used to be. I'm sorry, I said. And for the first time in my life, I meant it. I was arrogant. I thought the end justified the means. I thought I was the hand of God. Well, now I'm the hand of God, Miller said, pulling a long, serrated knife from a sheath at his waist. And God says it's time for the cleanup. Wait, I shouted, holding up my hands. Before you do this, there's something you need to know, something Vanessa hasn't told you. Vanessa leaned over the railing, her eyes narrowing. Don't listen to him, Miller. He's trying to stall. Miller, I said, keeping my voice steady. Look at the Lucy's Law file on the table, the one Kevin brought. Miller glanced at the folder. What about it? Open the back flap, the secret pocket, the one with the blue seal. Miller hesitated, then reached for the folder. He flipped to the back and pulled out a small, handwritten ledger. That's the record of the payments, I said. But look at the names of the recipients. Look at the names of the families who received the Lucy's Law settlements. Miller scanned the list. I watched as his expression shifted from rage to confusion, and then to a stunned, agonizing realization. He stopped halfway down the second page, his finger trembling against the paper. Maria Miller, he whispered. That was my mother. Your mother didn't die of neglect, Miller, I said, stepping closer. She died of cancer. And those settlements, the ones you think were bribes, they were the only reason she had a private room, a nurse, and the best medication money could buy. I couldn't get you out of prison without exposing my own corruption, but I made sure your family was taken care of. I've been paying for your niece's college tuition for the last 3 years. Miller looked up at me, the knife shaking in his hand. You've been paying? Check the dates, I said. Check the bank transfers. I didn't just pad my conviction rate, Miller. I tried to fix what I broke. I've been living with the guilt of your case for a decade. He's lying, Vanessa screamed from the catwalk. He's manipulating you. Miller, finish it now. Miller looked at the ledger, then at the laptop in Vanessa's hands, and then at me. The coalition of the broken was beginning to fracture. I saw the doubt in his eyes, the realization that he was being used as a pawn by the very people who had let his mother suffer until I stepped in. Vanessa, Miller said, his voice low and dangerous. Did you know about this? It doesn't matter, she yelled. The plan is bigger than your mother. The upload is at 90%. It matters to me, Miller said. He turned away from Kevin and started walking toward the stairs that led to the catwalk. Miller, stop, Vanessa shouted, her fingers flying over the keyboard. I'll kill him. I'll release the incest tapes right now. Go ahead, Miller said. But you're not leaving this hangar. Everything happened at once. Vanessa slammed the laptop shut and reached into her bag, pulling out a small silver pistol. She pointed it at Miller, but before she could fire, a shadow moved in the corner of the hangar. A gunshot echoed through the space, but it didn't come from Vanessa. It came from the catwalk, 10 feet behind her. Vanessa spun around, her eyes wide with shock, as she collapsed against the railing. Standing behind her, holding a suppressed handgun, was someone I hadn't seen in the light until now. It was Elena Moreno. Mother? Vanessa gasped, clutching her shoulder as she sank to the floor. Elena stepped into the yellow light, her face a mask of cold, calculating fury. She didn't look like a grieving sister anymore. She looked like a CEO closing a difficult deal. You were always too greedy, Vanessa, Elena said, her voice as smooth as glass. You wanted the $2 million for yourself. You were going to cut me out, weren't you? You were going to take the boat to the Caymans and leave me here to face the FBI. I was doing it for us, Vanessa wheezed. No, Elena said, pointing the gun at her daughter's head. You were doing it for you. You're just like your father. Loyal to no one, capable of anything. I stood frozen, watching the ultimate betrayal. The mother was killing the daughter to protect the plan or perhaps to take the spoils for herself. The Moreno legacy was cannibalizing itself in front of my eyes. Elena, stop, I shouted. The police are here. You can't get out. Elena looked down at me, a faint, eerie smile on her lips. The police aren't coming to the hangar, Richard. Gerald told them the airfield was a decoy. He sent them to the old quarry 5 miles north. We have 10 minutes before they realize their mistake. She turned back to Vanessa. Give me the laptop, now. It's encrypted. Vanessa coughed, blood bubbling at the corner of her mouth. Only I have the code. Elena's eyes flashed with rage. She stepped forward to grab the computer, but in that moment of distraction, Miller reached the top of the stairs. He lunged at Elena, his massive frame slamming into her, sending both of them crashing against the rusted railing. The laptop flew out of Vanessa's hands, tumbling through the air like a dying bird. It hit the concrete floor 40 feet below with a sickening crunch. The files, I yelled, running toward the wreckage. But I didn't go for the computer. I went for Kevin. I fumbled with the knots at his wrists, my fingers slick with his blood. Kevin, wake up. We have to go. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. Dad, the files. They're going to see. No one's seeing anything, I said, finally freeing his hands. I hauled him to his feet, his weight leaning heavily against me. Above us, the struggle continued. Miller and Elena were locked in a desperate, silent battle for the gun. Vanessa lay slumped against the railing, watching them with a dazed, hollow expression. And then, I heard it, the faint, high-pitched whine of a siren in the distance. Gerald hadn't sent them to the quarry. He'd lied to Elena. Richard. Gerald's voice boomed from the hangar entrance. He was standing there with a shotgun, his face set in a grim mask of determination. I called the feds. They're 2 minutes out. Elena froze. She looked at the entrance, then at the man she thought she'd broken. You betrayed me? I saved my family, Gerald said. I took them to a safe house an hour ago. You're done, Elena. Elena let out a scream of pure, unadulterated hatred. She shoved Miller back with a strength born of madness and turned the gun not toward Miller, not toward Gerald, but toward the stack of oil drums at the edge of the catwalk. If I don't get the legacy, she shrieked, no one does. She pulled the trigger. The spark hit the fuel-soaked drums. The explosion didn't just rock the hangar, it tore the world apart. A wall of orange flame erupted, consuming the catwalk in a roar of heat and light. I felt the shockwave throw me and Kevin across the concrete. I hit the floor hard, the air driven from my lungs. Through the smoke and fire, I looked up at the catwalk. The railing had given way. Miller was hanging on by one hand, his face etched with pain. Vanessa was gone, swallowed by the inferno. And Elena. Elena was standing at the edge of the flames, her clothes catching fire, her eyes fixed on me with a terrifying, final clarity. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there as the ceiling began to collapse. Richard! Gerald's voice was a muffled roar through the smoke. Get out of there! The whole place is going. I grabbed Kevin and started dragging him toward the door. I looked back one last time. Miller had managed to pull himself onto a support beam. He looked at me, gave a single, slow nod, and then disappeared into the black smoke. We cleared the hangar doors just as the secondary tanks blew. The entire structure folded in on itself like a house of cards, a pillar of fire rising into the night sky like a funeral pyre for the Moreno name. I collapsed onto the grass, Kevin cradled in my arms. We watched the fire burn, the blue and red lights of the police cruisers finally flooding the airfield. It was over. The secrets, the blackmail, the lies, they were all ash. But as the paramedics took Kevin from my arms and the federal agents began to swarm the site, I saw something in the grass near the hangar entrance. It was a small, silver thumb drive. I picked it up, my hands shaking. It was the fail-safe digital backup. Vanessa must have dropped it before the explosion. I looked at the drive, then at the burning wreckage of my life. I had the power to destroy every secret, to erase every Lucy's Law shadow, to make sure my reputation remained spotless. I could throw it into the fire and walk away as the hero who saved his son. But then I saw the name on the drive's label. It wasn't a file name. It wasn't a case name. It was a single word, written in Vanessa's elegant, flowing script. Truth. I looked at my son as they loaded him into the ambulance. He was looking at me, his eyes clear for the first time in months. He knew. He knew what I had done to save him, and he knew what I had done in the past. I didn't know then that the thumb drive would lead me to the final twist, the one that would change the meaning of everything I'd done for 38 years. But as I stood in the shadow of the fire, I realized that the hardest part of the war wasn't the fighting. It was the resolution. I sat in the plastic and chrome wasteland of the Parkland Memorial waiting room, the smell of industrial-grade disinfectant clinging to the back of my throat. My suit was ruined, blackened by smoke, torn at the shoulder, and stained with my son's blood, but I refused the nurse's offer of a hospital gown. I needed to feel the weight of what had happened. I needed the grit of the hangar floor under my fingernails to remind me that I was still alive and that my son was still breathing. Kevin was in surgery. A concussion, 2 broken ribs, and a deep laceration on his thigh from where Miller had tried to encourage his signature. The doctors said he would recover physically, but I knew the mental scars would be deeper. I had seen the look in his eyes when he thought he was a fugitive, a murderer, and a participant in a sin so dark it didn't have a name. I'd spent his whole life trying to build a pedestal for him to stand on, and in one night, I'd watched him fall into the mood because of my own ghosts. I pulled the silver thumb drive from my pocket. It felt heavy in my palm, a cold piece of metal that held the final piece of the puzzle. I'd told the FBI it was destroyed in the fire, a lie one of many I'd told lately. But I knew that if I handed it over to the authorities, the truth inside would be filtered through a dozen bureaucratic lenses. I needed to see it raw. I walked to the hospital's quiet chapel, a small room tucked away from the chaos of the ER. I opened my encrypted laptop, the one Gerald hadn't managed to compromise, and plugged in the drive. The folder wasn't filled with legal documents or financial ledgers. It was a single massive video file titled Project Legacy. I hit play. The image that flickered onto the screen wasn't from a dark hangar or a luxury restaurant. It was a high-resolution hidden camera feed from a law office I knew very well. I saw a man sitting behind a mahogany desk, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his silk tie worth more than a month of my pension. It was Edward Grant, the top-tier attorney I had hired to help me fight Vanessa. My breath hitched. I watched as Elena Moreno walked into the frame. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a meeting. Elena sat down, and Edward poured her a glass of crystal-clear water. "He's taking the bait, Elena." Edward's voice was smooth, devoid of the professional concern he'd shown me. "Richard thinks he's the hunter. He's already agreed to the Barmoy high-hour deadline. He's digging into your previous victims as we speak." Elena smiled on the screen, the same predatory smile I'd seen in the hangar. "And the Lucy's Law files? You're sure he has them?" "He has them, and he'll pull them from the safe the second he feels cornered. He's a man of habit. When he's threatened, he looks for his armor. For Richard, that armor is his secrets." I felt a cold, jagged spike of betrayal pierce my chest. Edward hadn't just been available when I called him. He had been the architect. He was the one who had reached out to Elena Moreno in the first place. He'd known about her brother, he'd known about her grudge, and he'd used her as a battering ram to get to my private files. But why? Edward was wealthy. He was successful. The video continued. "Why the son, Edward?" Elena asked. "Why the marriage scam? Why not just steal the files?" "Because I don't just want the files, Elena. I want the estate. I want the Porter name erased so I can take over the firm's private trusts. And more importantly, I want Richard to watch his son become exactly what he spent 40 years prosecuting. I want the irony to be the thing that kills him." The video cut to a series of audio recordings. Vanessa's voice. She wasn't talking to her mother. She was talking to Edward. "The boy is falling apart, Edward," Vanessa said, sounding bored. "He actually thinks he loves me. It's pathetic. When do I get the payout?" "The moment Richard wires the money to the Elite Wedding Designs account," Edward replied. "And remember, the second the transfer is confirmed, you release the incest documents. We need the scandal to be so loud that the FBI doesn't look at the bank trail. They'll be too busy dealing with the fallout of the incestuous prosecutor." I closed the laptop. My hands were shaking so violently I had to grip the edge of the pew to keep from falling. I had invited the devil into my home and paid him muitarm, born Tramdola, for the privilege of destroying my son. Edward Grant wasn't just a lawyer. He was a vulture who had been circling my life for years, waiting for me to retire so he could pick the bones. I'd seen a lot of monsters in 38 years, but I'd never invited one to dinner with a handshake. I looked at the cross at the front of the chapel. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," I whispered. "I thought I was protecting him." I didn't stay in the chapel to pray. I had a different kind of ritual in mind. I walked back to Kevin's room. He was awake now, his head swathed in bandages, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. When he saw me, he tried to sit up, but the pain pulled him back down. "Dad," he wheezed. "The police. They were here. They said, Vanessa is dead. They said, her mother. They're still searching the wreckage for her." "She's gone, Kevin," I said, sitting by his bed. I took his hand. His skin was cold. "The fire took everything." "Was it true?" he asked, his voice breaking. "The paper. The birth certificate. Was she?" "No," I said, my voice firm. "It was a lie, Kevin. A cruel, calculated lie designed to break your spirit. You are my only child. You have no sister. You committed no sin. You were just a good man who was targeted by people who don't know the meaning of the word." Kevin let out a breath, a long, shuddering sob that seemed to rack his entire body. The relief was so visible it was like watching a man being cut down from a noose. "But the files, Dad, the Lucy's Law thing. I saw them. I read them. You did those things." I didn't lie to him. "Not this time." "I did. I broke the rules to help people the system had forgotten. I was wrong to hide it from you, and I was wrong to think I could outrun the consequences. But those files are gone now, Kevin. They burned in the hangar." "Not all of them," Kevin whispered. He reached under his pillow and pulled out a single, crumpled envelope. It was stained with soot and blood. "I tucked this into my waistband when Miller wasn't looking. I thought if I didn't make it, you'd need the one that showed you weren't the only one." I opened the envelope. Inside was a ledger page from the Lucy's Law file, but it wasn't a record of my payments. It was a list of names of other prosecutors who had contributed to the fund, and at the very top of the list, dated 15 years ago, was Edward Grant. The irony was a physical blow. Edward wasn't trying to expose Lucy's Law because he was a crusader. He was trying to bury it because he was part of it, and he wanted to make sure that if the ship ever sank, I was the only captain on board. He wanted to use the scandal to destroy me while he walked away with the moral high ground and the money. I looked at my son, and for the first time in months, I felt a surge of something other than grief. I felt the cold, sharp edge of a plan. "Kevin," I said, leaning in, "do you trust me?" "With my life, Dad. You know that." "Good, because we're not going to wait for the FBI to finish their report. We're going to give Edward Grant exactly what he wanted. We're going to give him a wedding." I didn't know it yet, but the revenge plan I was forming in that hospital room would be my masterpiece. I wasn't going to sue him. I wasn't going to report him. I was going to use his own greed to lead him into a courtroom where the judge and jury wouldn't be strangers. I spent the next 48 hours in a whirlwind of activity. I called Gerald. "Richard, I'm so sorry." "Shut up, Gerald." I snapped into the phone. "You want to keep your family safe? You want to make up for the tracker? Then you do exactly what I tell you. You don't call the feds. You don't call the police. You call Edward Grant." "What am I supposed to tell him?" "Tell him the fire didn't destroy everything. Tell him you found a second safe in the study. Tell him it contains the original Lucy's Law ledger, the one with his signature on it. And tell him that I'm so broken by Kevin's suicide attempt that I'm ready to sign everything over just to make the world go away." "He won't believe you're that weak, Richard. He's been watching me for months, Gerald. He's seen me fail. He's seen me lie. He thinks I'm a relic. He wants the irony, remember? He wants to be the one to save the Porter estate." I hung up before he could argue. Then I made a call to a person I hadn't spoken to in years, a man named Judge Holloway. He was the one who had presided over the Moreno trial. He was retired now, living on a ranch in West Texas, but he owed me a favor from the time I'd kept his son's name out of a cocaine bust. "Holloway," I said when he answered, "I need a courtroom. For one night. Private. No records." "Richard, what the hell is going on?" "I saw the news about the hangar fire." "The fire was just the opening act, Arthur. I'm putting on a play, and I need the best stage in Dallas." The trap was set for Thursday night. I told Edward Grant to meet me at the old Dallas County Courthouse, the old red building. I told him I'd bribe the night guard to let us into the ceremonial courtroom so we could settle this like gentlemen without the firm's partners finding out. I told him I had the ledger, and I had the power of attorney papers ready to sign. I arrived at Muimot, Hong p.m. The building was a Gothic fortress of red sandstone, its towers looming over the city like silent sentinels of justice. I walked through the empty halls, my footsteps echoing on the marble, until I reached courtroom A. I sat at the prosecutor's table. I placed the Lucy's Law ledger in the center of the wood, its burnt edges a grim reminder of the airfield. A few minutes later, the heavy oak doors creaked open. Edward Grant walked in. He was wearing a trench coat over a tuxedo he'd likely come from a charity gala. He looked triumphant. He looked like a man who had already won. "Richard," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, high-ceilinged room. "You look terrible. Retirement hasn't been kind to you. Greed hasn't been kind to you, Edward," I said, not looking up. "I saw the video, the one Vanessa kept. She was recording you too, you know. She didn't trust you any more than I do." Edward paused, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Vanessa is dead, Richard, along with the laptop. You have nothing but a burnt book and a son who's one bad day away from a psych ward. I have the ledger, Edward. I have your signature from 15 years ago. If this goes to the Bar Association, you're finished. You won't just lose your firm, you'll lose your license." Edward laughed, walking toward the bar. "And if I go down, you go down 10 times harder. You're the one who started the fund. You're the one who saved the Moreno kid. I was just a junior associate following orders. I can spin that. You can't." He reached the table and looked down at the ledger. "Give it to me, Richard. Sign the papers, and I'll make sure the FBI forgets about the encrypted drive we found in the wreckage. I'll make sure Kevin gets the best doctors. I'll even let you keep the house." "You really want it that badly?" I asked, looking up at him. "The Porter legacy? I want the seat you sat in for 30 years. Edward hissed, leaning over the table. "I want the power you threw away. I'm the architect now, Richard, and you're just a footnote." I stood up slowly. "You're right about one thing, Edward. I am a man of habit, and my habit is always making sure there's a record." I reached under the table and pressed a button. The lights in the courtroom suddenly flared to life, not just the overheads, but the high-powered studio lights of a news crew. From the jury box, 6 people stood up. It wasn't a jury. It was the board of directors of the Dallas Bar Association. And standing in the witness box, holding a digital recorder, was my son, Kevin. But that wasn't the reversal. The reversal was the man who stepped out from the judge's chambers, wearing his black robes. It wasn't Judge Holloway. It was the Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court. "Mr. Grant," the justice said, his voice cold and booming in the silence. "I believe you were just discussing a criminal conspiracy to defraud a client and a sitting officer of the court. Would you like to repeat that for the record?" Edward turned white. He looked at the cameras, then at me, and then at the doors. But the doors were already opening, and the person walking through them made my heart skip a beat. It was Vanessa. She was alive. Her arm was in a sling, her face was pale, but she was very much alive. "Hello, Edward," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "You told me if I did the cleanup, you'd let me go, but then you tried to blow me up in that hangar." I looked at Edward. The architect had forgotten one thing about his building. If you build it on a foundation of betrayal, it doesn't take much to make the whole thing fall. "I didn't blow you up," Edward screamed, losing his composure. "That was Elena. She was the crazy one." "Elena is dead, Edward," Vanessa said, walking toward the bar. "But she wasn't the one who sent the text to Miller telling him to eliminate the witnesses after the fire started." "I have the phone, Edward." "The one you thought was Ash." I looked at the Chief Justice. "Your Honor, I believe we have enough for an immediate suspension and a referral to the Attorney General." Edward looked at me, his eyes wide with a manic, trapped energy. You used her? You saved her from the fire?" "I didn't save her," I said, looking at Vanessa. "Miller did. He realized that the only way to truly fix what I broke was to make sure the real monster didn't get away." I walked toward the doors, my son at my side. I didn't need to stay for the arrest. I didn't need to see the handcuffs. I'd seen it 1,000 times. But as we stepped out onto the courthouse steps, Kevin looked at me. "Is it really over now, Dad?" I looked at the thumb drive in my pocket. "The truth." "Not quite," I said. "There's one more thing Vanessa told me before we walked in there. Something about your mother, Kevin." "My mother? What does she have to do with this?" I looked at the dark streets of Dallas. "She didn't die of a heart attack, Kevin. Vanessa says she was the first person the architect ever practiced on. The revenge plan was just beginning. Because Edward Grant wasn't the architect, he was just the contractor. The city of Dallas was a blur of neon and shadow as we drove away from the courthouse. Kevin sat in the passenger seat, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights, looking like a man who had walked through a fire and realized he was still burning. The silence in the car wasn't empty, it was heavy with the ghost of my wife, Eleanor. I could almost smell her jasmine perfume in the upholstery, a cruel trick of the mind triggered by Vanessa's parting words. She didn't die of a heart attack, Kevin. She was the first person the architect ever practiced on. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. My mind was a courtroom where 1,000 pieces of evidence were suddenly being re-examined. Eleanor's death 11 years ago had been sudden, yes. A silent heart attack in her sleep, the doctors had said. I'd blamed myself for not being awake, for not hearing her heart stop. I'd spent a decade carrying that guilt like a stone in my pocket. Now the thought that her death was a practice run made my stomach churn with a cold, acidic fury. Dad, Kevin said, his voice barely audible. We have to look at the drive. Now. Not here, I said. We're going to the one place nobody expects. I didn't go home. I didn't go to the firm. I drove to the small, unassuming apartment I'd kept under a corporate name for decades, a bolt hole I'd used when I was prosecuting the cartels. Inside, the air was stale, but the connection was secure. I sat at the small kitchen table, my hands trembling as I plugged the silver thumb drive into a clean laptop. The file titled Truth was encrypted, but the password wasn't a string of numbers. It was a hint, the first case. I thought back to my early days in New Orleans. My first real win. It wasn't the Marino task force. It was a corruption case against a local developer named Julian Vane Silas, Vane's brother. I'd put him away for 20 years. I typed in Van Motngin Chin Chum Chin Mui Hai. The folder popped open. The first thing I saw was a medical report from Hang In Lair Mui Lum. It was Eleanor's autopsy, but it wasn't the one the coroner had given me. This one had a second page, a toxicology screen that had been suppressed. It showed trace amounts of a digitalis derivative, a heart medication Eleanor had never been prescribed. In small, consistent doses, it would mimic a natural decline until the heart simply gave out. Beneath the report was a video file. I clicked it, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footage was grainy, taken from a nanny cam we'd installed when Kevin was a baby and never removed. It showed our kitchen. I saw Eleanor, looking tired but beautiful, pouring a cup of tea. Then, a man walked into the frame. He was comfortable in our house. He was holding a small vial. It was Arthur Halloway. He wasn't a judge then. He was my mentor, my best friend. The man who had given the toast at our wedding. On the video, he was talking to Eleanor, his back to the camera, but I saw his hand hover over her tea. He was smiling. He was laughing. And then, he slipped something into the cup. You're a good friend. Arthur. Eleanor's voice came through the speakers, clear and sweet. Richard is lucky to have you looking out for him. I'm always looking out for the legacy, Eleanor, Halloway replied. Always. I slammed the laptop shut. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt like lead. Arthur Halloway hadn't just been my mentor. He had been the shadow behind every move I'd made for 40 years. He'd helped me create Lucy's Law not to help victims, but to create a leash he could pull whenever he needed me to lean a certain way on a case. And when Eleanor started asking questions, when she realized the settlements weren't just about justice, but about building a private war chest for Halloway's political ambitions, he'd quieted her. Forever. He killed her, Kevin whispered, his face ashen. He's been sitting at our Thanksgiving table for 10 years knowing he killed her. He didn't just kill her, Kevin, I said, the prosecutor's clarity returning with a vengeance. He used her death to bind me to him. He was the one who comforted me. He was the one who encouraged me to bury myself in work so I wouldn't look too closely at the toxicology. He's been the architect of my entire life. I looked at the Lucy's Law ledger page Kevin had saved. Halloway's name wasn't on it, but Edward Grant's was. Halloway had used Grant as his contractor, the face of the corruption, while he remained the untouchable figure in the black robes. The Moreno scam, Vanessa, the $2 million, it was all a diversion. Halloway knew I was getting old. He knew I was restless in retirement. He wanted to flush out the files, liquidate the estate, and tie up the last loose ends before he made his run for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. What do we do, Dad? Kevin asked. He's a Chief Justice. We can't just walk into a police station with a stolen nanny cam video from a decade ago. He'll bury it before it hits the scanner. I stood up, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. The grief was gone, replaced by a singular, burning purpose. You're right. We don't go to the police. We go to the source. Halloway thinks I'm a broken man who just survived a fire. He thinks I'm grateful to him for giving me that private courtroom tonight. He's waiting for me to call him and say thank you. Then let's give him a call, Kevin said, standing beside me. We drove to Holloway's ranch in Midlothian, not far from the airfield where the hangar still smoldered. The gates were open. He was expecting me. I left Kevin in the car with the engine running and the laptop open to the live stream. I walked onto the porch of the sprawling ranch house. Holloway was sitting in a rocking chair, a glass of bourbon in his hand, looking like the picture of a distinguished elder statesman. "Richard," he said, his voice warm and paternal. "I heard the news from the courthouse. Grant is in custody. Vanessa is talking. You've done it, old friend. You've saved the legacy." "The legacy is a lie, Arthur," I said, walking to the edge of the porch. "But the video isn't." Holloway didn't move, but the rocking of the chair slowed. "What video is that?" "The one from the kitchen 10 years ago. The one where you made Eleanor her last cup of tea." The silence that followed was different from any I'd experienced. It was the silence of a man who had already calculated his escape route and realized the bridge was out. Holloway took a slow sip of his bourbon. "Eleanor was a complication, Richard. She was going to go to the Ethics Commission. She didn't understand that the Lucy's Law money was necessary. It bought the influence we needed to keep men like Moreno in the ground. I did it for you. I did it for the law. You did it for yourself," I said. "And you used Vanessa to try and finish the job. You knew if she scammed Kevin, I'd be too humiliated to ever look back at your records. You wanted me to die a comfortable retired failure." Holloway stood up, the warmth in his eyes vanishing, replaced by the cold, steel gaze of the Chief Justice. "It doesn't matter, Richard. That video is inadmissible. The chain of custody is broken. The drive was stolen, and I am the highest judicial authority in this state. Who are you going to tell? The press? They'll call it the ramblings of a man who lost his wife to a heart attack and his son to a scam." "I'm not going to the press, Arthur," I said, stepping back into the shadows. "And I'm not going to a judge." "Then what are you doing here?" "I'm here to tell you that the tea is ready." Holloway frowned, but then his eyes widened. He looked down at the glass of bourbon in his hand. "Gerald didn't just betray me, Arthur," I said. "He betrayed you too. He was the one who brought the bourbon from your cellar tonight. And Gerald is very good at following instructions when his family's safety is on the line." Holloway dropped the glass. It shattered on the porch, the amber liquid soaking into the wood. He clutched at his chest, his breathing becoming ragged. You wouldn't. You're a prosecutor." I was a prosecutor," I corrected. "Tonight, I'm just a husband." I watched him sink into the rocking chair. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt a profound, heavy sense of closing the book. Holloway wasn't going to die, not tonight. The dose Gerald had put in the bottle was just enough to trigger a localized cardiac event, the kind that requires an immediate hospital stay and a full, non-suppressible toxicology report from a state-mandated physician. I'd already called the paramedics. And I'd already sent the truth file to the one person Holloway couldn't buy, the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District, a woman I'd trained personally, who had been waiting for a reason to take down the Chief Justice for years. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, I walked back to the car. Kevin was waiting. He saw my face and knew. "Is he? He's going to live just long enough to see his name erased," I said. We drove away from the ranch, leaving the sirens and the fire and the ghosts behind us. 6 months later, the Sunday lunch at the French Room was different. The Adolphus Hotel was just as grand, the lilies just as fragrant, but the table was smaller. It was just Kevin and me. Vanessa was serving 12 years for her part in the conspiracy, her cooperation with the feds the only thing that kept her out of a life sentence. Edward Grant was in a federal pen, disbarred and forgotten, and Arthur Holloway had died in custody while awaiting trial, his own heart finally giving out under the weight of his exposure. Kevin looked better. The bruises had healed, and the hollow look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, resilient strength. He'd started a non-profit to help victims of financial fraud, using a portion of the Porter estate to fund legal services for those who didn't have a father with a Lucy's Law background. "Dad," Kevin said, picking up his water glass, "I was thinking about what you said at the airfield, about how you can retirement from the prosecution, but the prosecutor never really retires from you. I might have been wrong about that," I said, looking out at the Dallas skyline. "I think the prosecutor finally went home that night. I looked at my son, really looked at him. He wasn't a mark. He wasn't a legacy. He was a man who had survived the worst the world could throw at him and come out with his heart intact." That was the real victory. So, Kevin said, a small, mischievous smile tugging at his lips, I met someone, a real person this time. She's a public defender. She thinks you're a legend, but she's also pretty sure she could beat you in a cross-examination. I laughed, a real, deep sound that felt like it was clearing out years of dust. A public defender? My house is going to be a war zone. Yeah, Kevin said, but at least the battles will be honest. I raised my glass of scotch. 2 honest battles, then. 2 honest battles. As we finished our lunch, I realized that the family revenge story didn't end with a payout or a body count. It ended here, in the quiet light of a Sunday afternoon, with a father and a son who finally had nothing left to hide. The secrets were gone. The architect was dead. And for the first time in 38 years, the world didn't need me to make it right. It was already right.